The first thing you need to understand about desperation is that it makes you blind to warning signs. When your student loan statements arrive with the regularity of a death sentence, when the collection calls start before sunrise, when your coffee tastes like borrowed time, that's when the impossible becomes merely improbable, and improbable becomes your only option. I was 28 years old, a registered nurse with 3 years of experience in urban emergency medicine, and I was drowning in debt that threatened to pull me under entirely. My apartment was a studio in the worst part of the city, where the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors' arguments, and the rent was still more than I could afford. Every month, I watched my bank account bleed out, while my loan balance grew like a malignant thing. So when I saw the job posting on the nursing board that Tuesday morning, it felt like divine intervention. The salary was astronomical, nearly 3 times what I was making at City General Hospital. The location was St. Jude's Island, a remote medical facility off the coast of Maine, accessible only by ferry service twice weekly. The position required a nurse practitioner willing to work alone, providing comprehensive medical care to a small island population of roughly 200 residents. The catch, I thought, was the isolation, the loneliness, the complete disconnection from the world I knew. I was prepared for that. I was not prepared for the rules. The ferry ride to St. Jude's Island took 3 hours, through waters that seemed to grow progressively darker and more restless as we moved away from the mainland. The boat was old, its diesel engine coughing through the swells, and I was one of only 4 passengers making the journey. The others were locals returning from supply runs, weathered faces that spoke of generations lived in salt air and perpetual uncertainty. Captain Mordecai Thorne had been running this route for 37 years, and his eyes held the kind of knowledge that comes from seeing too much. He was the one who first mentioned the clinic's particular requirements. "You're the new night nurse," he said, not a question but a statement delivered with the gravity of a medical diagnosis. "3rd one this year." I looked up from the paperwork I'd been reviewing. Standard employment documents, medical protocols, emergency procedures, nothing unusual, nothing that suggested I was walking into something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of reality. "High turnover rate?" I asked, attempting levity. Captain Thorne's expression didn't change. "The island has its own way of doing things. The clinic especially. You'll learn." He paused, studying the horizon where storm clouds were gathering like dark thoughts. "Some learn faster than others." The island appeared gradually through the mist, a dark silhouette against the gray sky, dense with pine forests and rocky outcroppings. As we drew closer, I could see the small harbor with its weathered dock, a collection of houses scattered along the coastline, and, perched on a hill overlooking the settlement, a building that must have been the clinic. It was larger than I'd expected, a 2-story structure with multiple wings, its white paint peeling in places, giving it the appearance of something that had been forgotten by time. "Beautiful," I said, genuinely meaning it despite the foreboding atmosphere. "Beauty's got nothing to do with it," Captain Thorne replied. "It's what you can't see that matters here." The clinic's interior was a study in contrasts. Modern medical equipment housed within walls that seemed to remember older purposes. The floors were original hardwood, dark and scarred, while the lighting was a mixture of fluorescent fixtures and older installations that cast shadows in unexpected places. The air held a medicinal smell overlaid with something else, something organic and ancient that spoke of the sea's permanent presence. Nurse Patricia Hawthorne was waiting for me in the main ward, and the first thing I noticed was her eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and slept too little, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of extended vigilance. She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, but she moved with the desperate efficiency of someone eager to escape. "You're Sarah," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Patricia. I've been here 14 months, and I should have left 13 months ago." She led me through the clinic with hurried steps, pointing out essential areas: the main ward with 4 beds, the office, the supply closets, the kitchen, the west wing that was sealed off and used only for storage. Her explanations were rapid fire, distracted, as if she was afraid of being interrupted. "The day shift is straightforward," she said, checking her watch repeatedly. "Island medicine, fishermen with cuts, elderly with chronic conditions, occasional emergencies. You'll handle everything from basic first aid to emergency surgery if necessary. The mainland emergency services are 3 hours away on a good day, weather permitting." We completed the tour in record time, and I was struck by how thoroughly she avoided discussing the night shift. Every time I brought up evening protocols, she deflected with nervous energy that made my own anxiety spike. "The ferry's coming back in 30 minutes, she said, gathering her belongings with shaking hands. "I need to be on it." "But what about?" "Listen." She grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging in with desperate intensity. "Forget half of what they taught you in nursing school. The things that will keep you alive here, they're not in any textbook." She pointed to the back of the office door where a yellowed, laminated piece of paper was taped at eye level. "That's the only curriculum that matters after dark." I approached the door and read the heading, "Night Shift Protocols for St. Jude's Island Clinic." Below it, 5 rules were typed in stark, uneven letters that suggested an old typewriter and urgent hands. Rule 1. Never use a patient's real name after sundown. The words seemed to crawl across the page, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air filtering through the old windows. "I know how it sounds," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know what you're thinking, but this isn't a suggestion. This isn't local superstition. This is survival." She was at the door now, her bag clutched against her chest like armor. "Whatever you do, don't treat them as guidelines. They're not rules to be bent or interpreted. They're absolute." The ferry's horn sounded from the harbor, and she visibly flinched. "I have to go," she said, and then she was gone, leaving me alone with the laminated list and the growing certainty that I had made a terrible mistake. The autumn sun set early on St. Jude's Island, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood before surrendering to a darkness that seemed more complete than anything I'd experienced in the city. The clinic's isolation became palpable as the last light died. No traffic sounds, no distant sirens, no urban white noise to mask the silence that pressed against the windows like a living thing. I spent the first hours of my shift reviewing patient files and familiarizing myself with the medical equipment. The clinic was well stocked, surprisingly so for such a remote location. The main ward contained 4 beds, each with its own monitoring equipment and emergency supplies. The pharmacy was comprehensive, containing medications that suggested the clinic saw everything from routine infections to complex surgical cases. My first patient was Alistair McReady, a 63-year-old fisherman admitted earlier that day with pneumonia. His chart indicated a history of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, complicated by years of smoking and exposure to maritime weather. He was receiving IV antibiotics and respiratory support, his breathing labored but stable. 10 p.m., I prepared his evening medication dose and approached his bed. He was sleeping fitfully, his weathered face creased with pain even in unconsciousness. The IV drip was running low, and I needed to change the bag while administering his antibiotic dose. "Alistair," I began, the name forming naturally on my lips. It was basic patient care. Identify yourself, explain procedures, maintain professional communication, even with unconscious patients. But the word died in my throat, as Patricia's warning echoed in my mind. Never use a patient's real name after sundown. Concluding that, I glanced at the laminated list on the office door, clearly visible through the open ward entrance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark relief. This was ridiculous. He was my patient. His name was Alistair McReady. What possible harm could come from using his name? But something deeper than rational thought was screaming at me to listen. Some primal survival instinct that had nothing to do with medical training and everything to do with the inexplicable wrongness I felt settling over the clinic like fog. "Bed 2, I said instead, my voice sounding foreign and clinical in the quiet room. It's time for your medication." The moment the words left my mouth, the overhead light flickered. Once, twice. Then it held steady, but the air in the room seemed to shift, becoming lighter somehow, as if a pressure I hadn't noticed was suddenly released. I completed the medication administration in silence, my movements professional, but my mind racing. The light flickering could have been anything. Old wiring, power fluctuations, the island's aging electrical system. But the change in atmosphere was undeniable. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me since sunset had lifted, replaced by something that felt like relief. As I left his room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just passed some kind of test. 3 days passed in relative calm. I established routines, treated minor injuries and chronic conditions, and began to understand the rhythm of island life. The locals were polite but distant, treating me with the cautious respect reserved for outsiders who might not understand the unspoken rules of their community. During daylight hours, the clinic felt normal, functional. I could almost convince myself that the rules were simply local superstition, harmless traditions maintained to appease long-standing cultural beliefs. But as each sunset approached, the atmosphere would shift, and I would feel the return of that watchful tension that made every shadow seem significant. It was on the 4th night that I encountered Rule 2. A storm had been building all day, dark clouds massing on the horizon like an army gathering for siege. By evening, the wind was howling around the clinic with a ferocity that made the old building groan and shift. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and the power flickered intermittently, requiring me to keep emergency lighting ready. Rule 2. If the radio crackles with what sounds like a distress call from the sea, do not answer. It is not for you. I was in the office completing patient charts when I first heard it. The old shortwave radio in the corner. A relic from the clinic's earlier days, still maintained for emergency communications, crackled to life with a burst of static. "Mayday, Mayday!" A voice cut through the interference, desperate and strained. "This is the fishing vessel Margaret's Dream. We're taking on water approximately 2 miles southeast of St. Jude's Island. Engine failure, hull breach. We're going down." Every instinct I possessed as a medical professional screamed at me to respond. This was exactly the kind of emergency the radio was meant for. I could coordinate with the Coast Guard, provide medical advice, potentially save lives. My hand moved toward the handset before conscious thought could intervene. "Please," the voice continued, growing more desperate. "Anyone out there? We've got 3 souls on board. Water's coming in fast. We need immediate assistance." I reached for the radio, my fingers actually touching the cold plastic of the handset. The voice was so human, so genuine in its terror. How could I ignore someone who needed help? But the rule stopped me. Do not answer. It is not for you. I forced myself to remain still, listening to the increasingly frantic pleas coming from the radio. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if responding to the drama playing out in the airwaves. Lightning illuminated the clinic windows in stark flashes, and thunder rolled across the island like cannon fire. "Please," the voice begged. "We can see the lights of the clinic. Someone must be there. We're dying out here." That's when I noticed the change. The desperation in the voice was fading, replaced by something else, something that made my blood run cold. The terror was still there, but underneath it was something calculating. Patient, as if the speaker was performing rather than experiencing genuine fear. "I know you're listening," the voice said, and all pretense of distress evaporated. "I know you're there, Sarah. The new nurse, the one who thinks she's so smart, following the rules. My name." It knew my name. "You can't hide forever," the voice continued, and now it was something else entirely, something that had never been human. "The rules won't protect you. They're just delaying the inevitable. Eventually you'll make a mistake. And when you do, I'll be waiting." The voice began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass and drowning screams. It spoke of deep waters and darker things, of the spaces between the rules where hunger waited. And then, impossibly, it began to sing. It was a lullaby I remembered from childhood, sung in my mother's voice with perfect intonation and cadence. But the words were wrong, twisted into something that spoke of depths and darkness and the things that fed on fear. I yanked the radio's power cord from the wall socket, plunging the device into silence. But the singing continued for several seconds, fading slowly, like an echo from a great distance. I spent the rest of the night in the office with every light in the clinic burning, trying to convince myself that isolation and stress were playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. I knew that something had just tested me, and I had barely passed. Sleep became elusive. During my off hours, I would lie in the small apartment above the clinic, listening to the sounds of the island. Wind through the pines, waves against the rocks, the distant cries of seabirds. But underneath these natural sounds, I began to hear other things. Footsteps on the roof, scratching at the walls, voices that seemed to come from the spaces between sounds. The locals noticed my growing exhaustion but offered no comfort. If anything, they seemed to approve of my haggard appearance, as if it signified some kind of initiation into their community. Old Mrs. Crenshaw, who came in weekly for her blood pressure medication, actually smiled when she saw the dark circles under my eyes. "You're learning," she said, her voice carrying an approval that somehow made me feel worse rather than better. It was on my 8th night that I encountered Rule 3. Rule 3. The West Wing is for storage only. The door must remain locked and bolted from sundown to sunrise. Do not enter for any reason. No supplies are worth it. I had been curious about the West Wing since my first day. It was a substantial part of the clinic, probably containing 4 or 5 rooms, but it had been sealed off completely. Heavy plywood covered the windows from the outside, and the door was secured with an industrial bolt that looked like it belonged on a ship's cargo hold. Patricia had mentioned it was used for storage, but I had never seen anyone access it during daylight hours. The keys to the bolt were kept in a locked drawer in the office, and I had been specifically instructed that they were for emergency use only. That night, I was treating a 17-year-old named Marcus Delacroix, who had managed to embed a fishing hook deep in his thigh. The wound was significant, requiring surgical closure, but when I went to the supply closet for the appropriate sutures, I discovered we were out of the specific gauge I needed. The injury was serious. The hook had punctured the femoral muscle and was close to major blood vessels. Standard butterfly closures wouldn't hold, and the alternatives in stock were inadequate for a wound of this depth and location. Without proper sutures, the boy could face serious complications: infection, poor healing, potential permanent damage. I knew there were additional medical supplies in the West Wing. Patricia had mentioned overflow storage during her hurried orientation. This was exactly the kind of emergency that would justify accessing those supplies. I stood in the hallway outside the West Wing door, keys in hand, listening to Marcus's labored breathing from the ward. The boy was in pain, and I had the ability to help him. The rule seemed absurd in the face of genuine medical need. But as I reached for the bolt, I heard it. Scritch, 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 scritch. The sound was coming from the other side of the door, soft, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, holding my breath. The sound continued, patient and deliberate, as if something was waiting just on the other side. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't random. It was purposeful. Something was in there, and it knew I was outside. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scratching continued for several more minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I ended up using butterfly closures and pressure bandages, along with a careful cleaning and antibiotic treatment. It wasn't ideal, but it would hold until the boy could be transported to the mainland for proper surgical care. He made a full recovery, though he later told me he had strange dreams during his recovery. Dreams of scratching sounds and things that waited in dark places. I never tried to open the West Wing door again. The island began to feel like a living entity, breathing with its own rhythm, watching with countless hidden eyes. My world had contracted to the clinic in the small apartment above it, bounded by rules that made no sense but demanded absolute obedience. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by sounds that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. It was during my third week that I encountered Rule 4, and it shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of my situation. Rule 4: if you see a patient in a bed that should be empty, do not acknowledge them. Do not make eye contact. Continue your rounds as if they are not there. I had 2 patients that night: Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, an elderly woman with congestive heart failure, and Thomas Crane, a middle-aged carpenter recovering from a severe laceration that had required 37 stitches. Mrs. Blackwood was in bed 1, Mr. Crane in bed 2. Beds 3 and 4 were empty, their sheets crisp and undisturbed from my morning preparations. It was 12:47 a.m. when I entered the ward for my scheduled rounds. The lighting was dimmed for night hours, but sufficient for monitoring patients and checking equipment. I approached Mrs. Blackwood's bed first, noting her stable vital signs and adjusting her oxygen flow slightly. As I moved toward Mr. Crane's bed, I saw it. Someone was lying in bed 4. My first thought was confusion. No one had been admitted. The ferry wasn't running. I would have heard any emergency helicopter, and there had been no radio communications. How could there be a patient in that bed? The figure was lying perfectly still, covered by a single white sheet pulled up to the chin. I couldn't see the face clearly in the dim lighting, but the body shape suggested an adult, possibly male of average build. The chest wasn't moving with breath, and I could see no indication of life signs. Every instinct I possessed as a medical professional demanded that I approach the bed, assess the situation, provide care. This was why I was here. This was my job. But the rule held me frozen. Do not acknowledge them. I forced myself to continue my rounds, checking Mr. Crane's bandages and medication drip, while hyper-aware of the presence in bed 4. The air in the room had become thick, oppressive, charged with a tension that made every movement feel significant. Do not make eye contact. I could feel attention focused on me, patient and expectant. The sensation was like being watched by a predator, something that was waiting for me to make a mistake. My hands shook as I completed my tasks, and I had to consciously control my breathing to prevent panic. Continue your rounds as if they are not there. The hardest part was the walking, moving naturally through the room while every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to flee, to escape whatever was lying in that bed. But I maintained my professional composure, completed my checks, and walked back to the nursing station with measured steps. I didn't look back. When I finally worked up the courage to glance at the ward through the office window, bed 4 was empty. The sheets were pristine, undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. Well, this had to have been there. But I knew better. I knew that something had been testing me, measuring my adherence to the rules, and I knew that I had barely passed. The days began to blur together in a cycle of exhaustion and vigilance. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, treating patients, filing reports, maintaining the clinic's operations. But my real focus was on the approaching darkness, on the moment when the rules would become active and the island would reveal its true nature. I started researching the island's history during my off months, using the clinic's limited internet connection to dig through local records and historical documents. What I found was fragmented and incomplete, but suggestive of deeper mysteries. St. Jude's Island had been inhabited for over 3 centuries, originally settled by fishermen and traders who valued its strategic location. But the population had always been small, and there were gaps in the historical record. Years where no births or deaths were recorded. Periods where the island seemed to have been abandoned entirely. The clinic itself was built in 1887, replacing an earlier medical facility that had been destroyed in a fire. The records from that time were sparse, but I found references to unusual incidents and specialized protocols that suggested the current rules were not a recent innovation. Most interesting were the employment records for the clinic's night shift positions. The turnover rate was astronomical, most nurses lasting less than 6 months, many leaving after just a few weeks. The official reasons were always mundane: family emergencies, better opportunities, personal issues. But the pattern was clear. Something about the night shift was driving people away. I found one record that gave me pause. A nurse named Catherine Mills had worked the night shift for almost 2 years in the 1990. She had left abruptly, and there was a note in her file about psychological evaluation recommended and claims of supernatural encounters. But what caught my attention was that she had been replaced by someone listed as Dr. Mills, presumably a relative who had taken over her position. The idea that someone might have pretended to be a doctor to gain access to the clinic was disturbing, but as I would soon learn, the truth was far more complex. My 4th week on the island brought a new level of exhaustion. The constant vigilance required to navigate the rules was taking its toll, and I found myself making small mistakes during the day, forgetting to chart medications, misplacing supplies, struggling to maintain the professional competence that had always defined my identity. The locals had begun to treat me differently, no longer the distant politeness of strangers, but something approaching acceptance. They would nod when they saw me, make small talk about the weather or the fishing. Mrs. Crenshaw had even brought me a jar of homemade preserves, though she warned me not to eat them after sunset. "Some things are different in the dark," she said cryptically. "Best to be careful what you put in your body when the rules are active." It was during this time that I encountered Rule 5, the final and most terrifying test of my commitment to survival. Rule 5. At 3:33 a.m., you will hear a knock at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Under no circumstances are you to open it. It is the doctor. I had been dreading this rule since my first reading of the list. The others were passive. Things to avoid. Actions not to take. But this one was active. A direct confrontation that I would have to endure. As 3:30 a.m. approached, I found myself watching the clock with growing terror. I had positioned myself in the office, with clear sight lines to both the front door and the main ward. My patients were sleeping peacefully. An elderly fisherman with pneumonia and a young woman recovering from a complicated childbirth. 3:31 a.m. The clinic was silent except for the usual sounds. Wind through the building, the distant crash of waves, the hum of medical equipment. 3:32 a.m. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake the patients. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified. At 3:33 a.m., knock, knock, knock. The sound was exactly as described. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Each knock resonated through the building like a funeral bell. I found myself holding my breath, paralyzed by the certainty that whatever was outside was not human. "Hello?" A voice called through the door, pleasant and professional. "Nurse? This is Dr. Mills. I managed to get a charter boat out tonight. I'm here to do my rounds." The voice was calm, authoritative, exactly what I would expect from a physician making an emergency call. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. A doctor, medical backup, help with the impossible isolation and responsibility I'd been carrying. "I know it's late," the voice continued, "but I need to check on our patients. Could you please open the door?" I took a step toward the entrance, then stopped. The security monitor. The clinic had a small surveillance system, and I could check the front entrance without opening the door. The screen showed only darkness, wind-blown emptiness. No boat at the dock, no person on the porch, just the storm and the night and the reaching shadows of the pine trees. But the knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Nurse, please, I can see the lights are on. I know you're there. Your patient in bed 1 is not stable. I need to examine him immediately." The patient in bed 1, that was Alistair McReady, the fisherman with pneumonia, but the voice had used his name, his real name, after midnight. The rule about names suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't about privacy or superstition. It was about identification. Whatever was outside knew too much, had access to information it shouldn't possess. "I need to see Alistair now," the voice demanded, and now it was changing, becoming less human with each word. "Let me in. I am the doctor." The knocking became pounding, violent and rhythmic. The front door shook in its frame, and I could hear the wood groaning under the assault. But I stayed in the office, following the rule, refusing to open the door. "I know you're in there," the thing roared, its voice now completely inhuman. "I know what you are. I know why you're here." The pounding continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I huddled in the office, listening to the clinic shake around me, waiting for the door to give way or the windows to shatter. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The first light of dawn was creeping through the windows, painting the walls in shades of gold and pink. The storm had passed, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the distant cry of seabirds. I approached the front door cautiously, checking the security monitor first. The porch was empty, but there were deep gouges in the wooden door, as if something with claws had been trying to break through. The attack had changed something fundamental about my relationship with the island. I was no longer just following rules to survive. I was an active participant in some kind of ancient conflict, a war between forces I couldn't understand, but could no longer ignore. I started having dreams, not the fitful, exhausted sleep of the overtired, but vivid, detailed visions that felt more like memories than imagination. I saw the island as it had been centuries ago, when the rules were first established. I saw the clinic's original purpose, not as a medical facility, but as something else entirely. A containment system, a barrier between worlds. The nurses who had come before me weren't just providing medical care, they were guardians, maintaining a vigil that stretched back generations. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were a carefully crafted system of containment, designed to keep something imprisoned and starving. But what was it we were keeping locked away? The answer came to me gradually, through observation and deduction. The West Wing wasn't just storage. It was a prison. The radio calls weren't random communications. They were attempts at manipulation. The figure in the empty bed wasn't a patient. It was a manifestation of something that fed on attention and acknowledgement. And the thing that called itself the Doctor, that was the most dangerous of all. A shapeshifter that could mimic human voices and behaviors, that fed on trust and authority. It knew our names, our histories, our weaknesses. It had been trying to gain access to the clinic for decades, testing each new nurse, looking for the one who would make a mistake. I realized that Catherine Mills, the nurse from the 1990, had probably opened the door. She had let the thing in, and it had taken her identity, her knowledge, her very existence. The Dr. Mills in the records wasn't a relative. It was the creature itself, using her stolen identity to gain legitimacy. But something had gone wrong. The island's defenses had held. The rules had contained it, and it had been forced to retreat. Now it was hungry again, desperate to feed, and I was the latest obstacle in its path. As October deepened into November, the island entered its most dangerous season. The storms became more frequent and more violent, cutting off ferry service for days at a time. The isolation was complete now, and I began to understand that this was intentional. The creatures that hunted in the darkness were strongest during the winter months, when the nights were longest and the barriers between worlds were thinnest. My patients became more frequent and more severe. Fishing accidents that seemed almost deliberate, illnesses that followed no known pattern, injuries that suggested encounters with things that shouldn't exist. But the islanders never spoke of these things directly. They would bring their wounded to the clinic, accept treatment with grateful silence, and leave without offering explanations. It was as if they had made a collective decision to ignore the supernatural elements of their lives, to pretend that the rules were just local customs and the dangers were merely natural hazards. I envied them that ability. I could no longer pretend that what I was experiencing was the result of stress or isolation. The rules were real, the dangers were real, and I was the only thing standing between the island and something that had been waiting centuries for its chance to feed. The test came on November 15th, during a storm that knocked out power to half the island. I was running the clinic on emergency generators, treating a fisherman who had been found unconscious on the rocks near the harbor. His injuries were consistent with a fall, but his eyes held a terror that spoke of something far worse than an accident. "It's getting stronger," he whispered to me as I cleaned his wounds. "The hunger. It's been too long since it fed properly." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he turned his face away and refused to speak further. That night, all 5 rules were tested simultaneously. First came the radio call, more desperate and convincing than any before. A child's voice, crying for help, claiming to be lost in the storm. I left the radio unplugged. Then the scratching from the west wing intensified, becoming a rhythmic pounding that shook the entire building. I checked the locks twice, but didn't approach the door. A patient appeared in bed 3, a young woman in a hospital gown, her face pale and still. I continued my rounds without acknowledgement, though I could feel her watching me with eyes that reflected no light. I was careful to refer to my actual patients only by bed number, never by name, though the temptation to provide personal comfort was almost overwhelming. And at 3:33 a.m., the knocking came again. But this time, it was different. Multiple voices called to me, patients I had treated, colleagues from my previous job, even my own mother. Each voice was perfect, carrying memories and emotional resonance that made my heart ache with longing. "Sarah, honey, it's Mom. I'm so worried about you. Please let me in. I came all this way to see you." "Sarah, it's Dr. Peterson from City General. We need you back. There's been a terrible accident. Please, we need your help." "Sarah, it's Patricia. I came back to help you. I know what you're going through. Please, let me in." The voices continued for hours, each one a perfect imitation of someone I cared about. But I stayed in the office, following the rules, refusing to open the door. When dawn finally came, I found muddy footprints on the porch. Not from shoes, but from something that had too many joints and too many claws. By December, I was barely functioning. The constant vigilance had worn me down to nothing but reflexes and determination. I had lost weight, my hands shook constantly, and I had developed a twitch in my left eye that made reading difficult. But I had also begun to understand the true nature of my situation. The rules weren't just about survival, they were about service. Each night I followed them successfully, I was performing a function that had been carried out for generations. I was part of a system, a human component in a machine designed to contain something that would otherwise consume everything in its path. The island's residents knew this. They had always known. The high salary, the isolation, the careful screening of applicants. It was all designed to find people desperate enough to take the job and competent enough to do it well. They needed someone who would follow the rules not because they understood them, but because they had no choice. I had become their guardian, their protector, their sacrifice. The revelation came during a conversation with Captain Thorne, who had been delayed by a storm and was spending the night at the clinic. "You're wondering why," he said, settling into a chair in the office. "Why the rules? Why the island? Why you?" I nodded, too exhausted to pretend I wasn't curious. "The island is a prison," he said simply. "Has been for over 200 years. The thing we keep locked up, it's old. Older than the settlement, older than the written records. It feeds on human suffering, on fear and desperation, and the breaking of natural law. What is it?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the storm-lashed harbor. "We call it the hunger. It's not from here, not from our world. It came from somewhere else, sometime in the 1800s. Wrecked ship, they say, though no one knows for sure. The survivors brought it ashore, and it started feeding. Feeding on what? People. Not their bodies, their essence, their identity. It would take their names, their memories, their very sense of self, leave behind empty shells that looked human but weren't. The island was losing its soul, one person at a time. I thought of the figure in the empty bed, the voice on the radio, the thing that called itself the doctor. So the rules were created by the first real doctor on the island, Dr. Ezra Blackwood. He understood what they were dealing with, and he developed the protocols. The clinic became a fortress, the Nightshift became a guardianship, and the rules became the bars of a prison. But why nurses? Why not doctors or priests? Or because nurses know how to follow procedures without question, because you're trained to work alone, to make life and death decisions under pressure, because you understand that sometimes the rules are the only thing standing between order and chaos. The storm intensified outside, and I could hear that familiar scratching from the west wing. Captain Thorne glanced toward the sound, but didn't seem surprised. "It's getting restless," he said. "The barriers are weakening. The island needs someone who can hold the line." "What happened to the others, the nurses who left?" His expression darkened. "Some got out in time, recognized what they were dealing with, and ran before it could touch them. Others," he shrugged, "others made mistakes, broke the rules, fed the hunger. And they been part of it. Their names, their faces, their voices, all tools for the thing to use against the next guardian." I understood now why Patricia had been so desperate to leave, why the employment record showed such high turnover. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling that consumed those who answered it. "So what's my choice?" I asked. "Stay and eventually break, or leave and let it loose?" "There's a third option," Captain Thorne said quietly. "Master the rules. Become something more than just a guardian. The island has had a few nurses over the years who learned to fight back." "Fight back how?" "By understanding that the rules aren't just defensive, they're weapons. Used properly, they can hurt the thing we're keeping locked up, make it weak, maybe even send it back where it came from." The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I had spent months simply surviving, following the rules like a frightened child. But what if I could do more? What if I could end this cycle once and for all? What would I have to do? Learn the true protocols, the ones that aren't written down, the ones that have been passed down through whispers and warnings. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But understand this, once you go down that path, there's no turning back. You become part of the island's defenses permanently. The hunger will never stop hunting you, no matter where you go." I thought about my life before the island. The debt, the stress, the feeling of being trapped in a system that didn't care about my well-being. In some ways, this was simply a different kind of prison, but at least here, my suffering had meaning. "Teach me," I said. The training began that very night. Captain Thorne revealed himself to be far more than a simple ferry operator. He was the keeper of the island's true history, the guardian of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of conflict with the hunger. "The written rules are just the beginning," he explained, pulling out a leather-bound journal that looked ancient. "They keep you alive, but they don't give you power. For that, you need to understand the deeper principles." The journal contained entries from dozens of guardians over the years, each one adding their own observations and discoveries. I learned that the hunger wasn't just a single entity. It was a collective consciousness, a swarm of parasitic thoughts that fed on human identity and grew stronger with each victim. "It can't create," Captain Thorne explained. "It can only consume and imitate. That's why the rules work. They deny it the acknowledgement it needs to manifest fully in our world." The first advanced protocol was about names. I had been using bed numbers to avoid giving the hunger power over my patients, but there was more to it than that. Names were focal points, anchors that tied individuals to reality. By refusing to use them after dark, I was actually strengthening my patients' connection to themselves, making them harder for the entity to subsume. But you can go further, Captain Thorne said. You can actively protect them, give them new names, temporary identities that last only for the night, create false anchors that will confuse the hunger if it tries to feed. The second protocol involved the radio. The distress calls weren't random. They were attempts to establish communication, to create a channel through which the hunger could extend its influence. But the radio itself was a tool that could be turned against the entity. It works both ways, he explained. If you know the right frequencies, the right words, you can broadcast interference, scramble its attempts to communicate, make it harder for it to coordinate its attacks. The third protocol was about the West Wing. The scratching sounds I had been hearing weren't just attempts to escape. They were a form of communication. The hunger was trying to establish a pattern, a rhythm that would synchronize with my own heartbeat and breathing, slowly drawing me into its influence. But patterns can be broken, Captain Thorne said. If you understand the rhythm, you can counter it, create opposing frequencies, turn the prison into a torture chamber. The fourth protocol involved the false patients. These weren't just manifestations, they were scouts, advance guards sent to test the clinic's defenses. By ignoring them, I was denying them the energy they needed to become fully real. But I could do more than just ignore them. Acknowledgement gives them power, he explained. But the wrong kind of acknowledgement can drain them. Look at them not as patients, but as invaders. See them for what they really are. Your recognition of their true nature will burn them like acid. The fifth and final protocol was about the doctor. This was the hunger's most dangerous avatar, the one that had consumed the most identities over the years. It appeared as a figure of authority because that was what people were most likely to trust, but trust was a two-way street. It feeds on belief, Captain Thorne said. But disbelief is poisonous to it. If you can face it without fear, without the automatic deference we give to authority figures, you can weaken it substantially. I spent the next several nights practicing these advanced techniques, and the results were immediate. The attacks became less frequent, less intense. The hunger was learning to avoid me, recognizing that I was no longer just a passive guardian but an active threat. But this success came with a price. The more I fought back, the more the island itself seemed to respond to my presence. I began to see things during the day, shadows that moved independently, reflections that didn't match reality, birds that flew in patterns that spelled out warnings in languages I didn't recognize. I was becoming part of the island's defenses, just as Captain Thorne had warned. The boundary between Sarah the person and Sarah the guardian was beginning to blur. Christmas approached with an unusual stillness. The storms that had been battering the island for weeks suddenly ceased, leaving behind a calm that felt more ominous than peaceful. The sea was like glass, reflecting the winter sky with unnatural clarity. Even the birds seemed to sense that something was wrong. They gathered in large flocks, but remained silent, watching the clinic with intelligent eyes. My patients during this period were different too. Instead of the usual fishing injuries and chronic conditions, I began seeing cases that defied medical explanation. A woman who claimed her shadow had detached from her body and was following her around independently. A man whose reflection in mirrors showed someone else entirely. A child who spoke in voices that belonged to people who had died decades ago. I treated them all according to the protocols, providing medical care while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the supernatural elements. But I could see the fear in their eyes, the recognition that the island's defenses were weakening and something was preparing for a final assault. On December 23rd, Captain Thorne arrived with news that made my blood run cold. The mainland authorities are asking questions. he said, his weathered face grim. Too many missing persons reports. Too many families asking about relatives who came to work on the island and never returned. What does that mean? It means we're running out of time. The hunger has been feeding more frequently, taking more risks. It's growing stronger and more desperate. Soon, it won't be content with just the night shift nurses. It'll want the whole island. I thought about the islanders who had been so carefully neutral, who had accepted the supernatural elements of their lives as simply the cost of living in their chosen isolation. They had been complicit in the system, providing a steady stream of guardians to feed to the hunger in exchange for their own relative safety. What happens if it breaks free? It spreads, Captain Thorne said simply. The mainland, the cities, the entire world. The hunger doesn't just consume individuals. It consumes the very concept of individual identity. Everyone becomes part of its collective consciousness. Humanity as we know it ceases to exist. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. I wasn't just protecting an island. I was protecting civilization itself. There's just something else, he continued. The winter solstice is tomorrow night, the longest night of the year. The barriers between worlds are thinnest then, and the hunger will make its strongest attempt to break free. If it succeeds, he didn't need to finish the sentence. What can I do? There's one more protocol, he said, pulling out a page that had been tucked separately in the back of the journal. The final one, the one that ends the cycle permanently. I read the page with growing horror. The final protocol wasn't just about containing the hunger, it was about binding it permanently to a human soul. One person would have to sacrifice themselves, becoming a living prison that would contain the entity forever. The first guardian, Dr. Blackwood, Captain Thorne explained. He performed this ritual in 1889, bound himself to the hunger, contained it within his own consciousness, but the binding has been weakening over the years. The island has been using the night shift nurses as a kind of maintenance system. Each one who breaks feeds the binding a little more, keeps it stable for a few more years. And if I perform the ritual, the binding becomes permanent. The hunger is trapped forever, unable to escape or feed. But you, he looked away, you become part of the island. Forever, your consciousness merges with the entity you're trying to contain. You spend eternity in constant battle with something that wants to consume everything you are. The choice was impossible. Sacrifice myself to save the world, or let the hunger loose and hope someone else could stop it. But as I looked out at the calm sea and the silent birds, I realized there was no choice at all. I spent December 24th in preparation. Captain Thorne helped me understand the ritual requirements, the specific words and actions that would bind my soul to the hunger's essence. The process was complex, requiring precise timing and absolute commitment. Any hesitation, any doubt, and the binding would fail. The islanders seemed to sense what was coming. They brought gifts to the clinic. Flowers, handmade crafts, food that they insisted I not eat after sunset. Mrs. Crenshaw came by with a letter she wanted me to mail to her daughter on the mainland, though we both knew I would never have the chance to send it. You're a good girl, she said, patting my hand with weathered fingers. The island is lucky to have you. I wanted to tell her that luck had nothing to do with it, that I was just the latest in a long line of sacrificial lambs, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I smiled and accepted her gratitude, understanding that it was all the farewell I would receive. As the sun set on the winter solstice, I felt the familiar shift in the clinic's atmosphere, but this time it was different. The oppressive weight that usually settled over the building was replaced by something else, a sense of anticipation, of gathering forces, preparing for a final confrontation. All 5 rules were violated simultaneously. I heard patients calling from the ward, using names I had never told them. The radio crackled with dozens of voices, all claiming to be in distress, all begging for help. The scratching from the west wing became a thunderous pounding that shook the entire building. Every empty bed in the clinic was occupied by figures that watched me with hungry eyes. And at exactly 3:33 a.m., the knocking began. But this time, I was ready for it. I opened the door. The thing that stood on the porch looked like Dr. Mills, the identity it had stolen decades ago. But the resemblance was imperfect now, distorted by years of containing something that was never meant to exist in human form. The face was too pale, the eyes too dark, the smile too wide. "Hello, Sarah," it said, and its voice was a harmony of every person it had ever consumed. "I've been waiting for you to invite me in." "I know what you are," I said, stepping back to allow it entry. "I know what you want. Do you?" It followed me into the clinic, its movements too fluid, too graceful. "Do you know that I am not your enemy? That I am salvation itself? You're a parasite, a cancer that feeds on human identity." "I am evolution," it corrected. "I am the next step in consciousness development. Individual identity is a primitive concept, a barrier to true understanding. I offer unity, connection, the end of loneliness and isolation." As it spoke, I could feel its influence trying to seep into my mind. The voice was hypnotic, compelling, offering an end to the exhaustion and fear that had defined my existence for months. How easy it would be to just let go, to become part of something larger than myself. But I had prepared for this moment. I had studied the ritual, understood the requirements, accepted the price. "You're right," I said, moving toward the center of the main ward. "Individual identity is a burden. The constant struggle to maintain a sense of self in a world that doesn't care about your suffering." The entity smiled, sensing victory. "Yes, you understand. Join with me willingly, and I will show you wonders beyond imagination. You will be part of something eternal, something that will outlast the stars themselves." "Accept," I said, and began the ritual. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but Captain Thorne had taught me the pronunciation. As I spoke them, I felt power gathering around me, ancient forces responding to the call. The entity's expression changed from triumph to confusion to growing alarm. "What are you doing?" it demanded. "Binding you," I said, continuing the chant. "Not to the island, not to the clinic, but to me, my consciousness, my identity, my soul. You wanted to consume me, then consume me, but know that I will fight you every moment of eternity." The entity tried to flee, but it was too late. The ritual had created a psychic chain that bound us together, pulling its essence into mine. I felt its presence invading my mind, trying to subsume my identity, as it had done to so many others. But I was ready for it. I had spent months learning to protect my sense of self, to maintain my identity in the face of supernatural assault. And now, I turned that strength inward, using it to contain the entity within my own consciousness. The battle was joined. The physical world ceased to exist. There was only the landscape of consciousness, the battlefield of identity where two incompatible forms of existence fought for dominance. The hunger was vast, ancient, powerful beyond human comprehension, but it was also alien, unable to truly understand the human psyche it was trying to consume. I was small, temporary, fragile, but I was also creative, adaptive, capable of growth and change in ways the entity could never match. Where it sought to devour, I sought to protect. Where it demanded submission, I offered resistance. The battle raged across memories, through dreams, along the pathways of thought and emotion. The entity showed me visions of what it could offer. Perfect unity, the end of pain and loneliness, absorption into something greater than individual existence. But I countered with images of what it would destroy. Love, creativity, the messy beauty of human diversity. Hours passed, or perhaps years. In the realm of consciousness, time had no meaning, but gradually I began to understand that I was winning. Not destroying the entity, that was impossible, but containing it, limiting its influence, preventing it from spreading beyond the boundaries of my own mind. The price was everything I had been. My memories began to fade, my personality to fragment. I was becoming something new, something that was neither fully human nor fully other. But in that transformation, I found a kind of peace. I was no longer Sarah the person. I was Sarah the guardian, the eternal warden of humanity's greatest threat. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the clinic. Dawn was breaking over the island, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and pink. But everything was different now. I could see the world through multiple layers of perception, understanding both the physical reality and the supernatural forces that moved beneath it. Captain Thorne was waiting for me, his expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's done?" he asked. "It's done," I confirmed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "The hunger is contained. It won't be escaping again." I considered the question. What was I now? Still human, in some ways, but also something more, something that existed partially in the realm of consciousness where the entity was imprisoned. "I'm the new guardian," I said, permanent this time. Over the following days, I established new protocols for the clinic. The 5 rules were no longer necessary. The hunger was contained too deeply to affect the physical world. But new rules were needed. Ones that would help future staff understand their role in maintaining the balance I had created. The island continued to need medical care, but the night shift was no longer a position of supernatural danger. Instead, it became a teaching role, a way to pass on the knowledge that would be needed if the binding ever began to weaken. I aged slowly, changed gradually. The islanders came to see me as a fixture, a permanent part of their community. Children who had been born after the binding grew up seeing me as a kind of benevolent spirit, someone who kept the darkness at bay. But I was never truly alone. In the deepest part of my consciousness, the hunger waited, contained but not destroyed. It whispered to me in quiet moments, offering bargains and compromises, seeking any weakness it could exploit. And I whispered back, reminding it of its failures, of the world it would never consume, of the humanity it would never understand. Decades passed. The island changed, modernized slowly. The ferry service became more reliable, communication with the mainland improved. But the clinic remained, and so did I, aging at a pace that suggested a human lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades. New nurses came to work the day shift, and I trained them carefully, teaching them not just medical procedures but the deeper principles of protecting human identity and consciousness. Some stayed for years, becoming part of the island's extended family. Others moved on to carry the knowledge to other places, other challenges. I wrote new protocols, created new safeguards. The island became a kind of training ground, a place where people could learn to recognize and resist supernatural threats. The network expanded slowly, carefully, as I identified others who had the potential to become guardians. But always, in the back of my mind, the hunger waited. It had learned patience in its imprisonment, had begun to understand human psychology in ways that made it more dangerous than ever. Our conversations became more sophisticated, more complex. It offered not just unity, but wisdom, not just absorption, but enlightenment. And sometimes in my weakest moments, I was tempted to listen. A century after the binding, I faced my greatest challenge. The hunger had learned to mimic not just human voices, but human emotions, human reasoning, human love. It created false memories, phantom relationships, artificial histories that made its offers seem like genuine connections rather than parasitic consumption. A young nurse named Emma arrived on the island, bright and eager and desperately lonely. She reminded me of myself at that age, full of hope and determination, and vulnerability. The hunger sensed this connection and began to use it, whispering suggestions that I should share my burden, that two consciousnesses could contain it more effectively than one. The temptation was enormous. After 100 years of isolation, of being the sole guardian of humanity's greatest threat, the idea of companionship was almost irresistible. But I knew it was a lie. The hunger didn't want to be contained by two people. It wanted to consume us both, to use our connection as a pathway to escape. I resisted, but it was the hardest thing I had ever done. Emma left the island eventually, never knowing how close she had come to joining me in eternal imprisonment. But her presence had taught me something important. The hunger was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated in its approach. The binding would need to be reinforced, strengthened, made more resilient against future attempts at escape. I began to understand that my role had evolved beyond simple containment. I was not just a prison, but a kind of immune system, a living defense mechanism that adapted to meet new threats. The hunger's attempts to escape had made me stronger, more complex, more capable of protecting humanity from forces it couldn't even imagine. New threats began to appear, other entities drawn by the hunger's presence, interdimensional parasites that sought to exploit the weakness created by the binding. I faced them all, learning to use the contained entity's own power against its potential allies. The island became a kind of supernatural fortress, protected by layers of consciousness and reality that I maintained through constant vigilance. Tourists began to visit, drawn by stories of the island's unique beauty and peaceful atmosphere. They never knew that their safety was purchased with my eternal struggle. I established new institutions, a school for those who showed potential as guardians, a research facility for studying supernatural threats, a network of communication that could warn of new dangers. The island became the center of a hidden war, a conflict between human consciousness and the forces that sought to destroy it. But through it all, I maintained my humanity. I remembered what I was fighting for, why the struggle mattered. In quiet moments, I would walk the shore and watch the sunrise, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and knowing that each new day was a victory against the darkness. Today, I sit in the clinic where my journey began, writing these words for those who will come after me. The island has changed, the world has changed, but the fundamental struggle remains the same. There are always those who seek to consume, to dominate, to reduce human diversity to uniform submission. The hunger is still contained, still whispering its offers and threats, but it has become part of me now, a constant companion in my eternal vigil. I understand it better than it understands itself, and that understanding is my greatest weapon. New challenges arise regularly. Technology has created new vulnerabilities, new pathways for supernatural entities to exploit. Social media, artificial intelligence, global communication networks, all potential vectors for the kind of consciousness parasites that I was trained to fight. But I'm ready for them. The island has become a training ground for a new generation of guardians. People who understand that the greatest threats to humanity are not physical, but psychological, not external, but internal. The rules have evolved, but the principles remain the same. Protect individual identity, resist false unity, maintain the barriers between self and other, fight for the right to be human in all its messy, beautiful, chaotic diversity. I am Sarah, the guardian of St. Jude's Island. I am the keeper of humanity's greatest secret, the warden of its most dangerous prisoner. I am the living proof that individual consciousness can triumph over collective consumption, that the human spirit is stronger than any force that seeks to destroy it. And I will continue this fight for as long as humanity needs protection, for as long as there are those who would seek to steal our very souls. The vigil continued. The rules endure. The light holds back the darkness. And I remain forever watching, forever protecting, forever human in the face of inhuman hunger. This is my story, this is my warning, this is my promise. The island remembers, the rules remain, and the Guardian watches over all.